Hello everyone and welcome back to TowerGate. It is day 146, July the 29th, 2017, Saturday. Hopefully you all are having a good weekend, or a good start to it anyway. It's a beautiful day here in southern Ohio. Very low humidity, sunny, nice, breezy, cool breeze blowing out of the east, the northeast. It's a wonderful day. Now I'm happy to be here with you this morning because we have some important information to get to today. A lot to get to, so let's get started. Well, by now I'm sure you all have witnessed and have had a chance to chew on the aftermath of the John McCain episode, casting his last, possibly his last really important vote as a senator from Arizona. And what he did was he voted against the skinny healthcare repeal bill to send it down to defeat. And he was a vote they were counting on. Now, this will backfire on McCain big time. There's a lot to talk about with this particular issue. You could tell when John McCain walked up to the table to give his thumbs down that Mitch McConnell, who was standing right there with a big smile on his face until he saw the thumbs down, then he went stone-faced like he'd been hit in the head with a shovel. Totally blew him away. This tells you that Mitch McConnell had no idea John McCain was going to cast that vote. You see, the Senate Majority Leader has a whip, a man who works under him, who goes and tallies the votes. They do not bring these types of votes to the floor to have the vote until they got the votes. The vote on the floor is a procedural matter. The votes are counted before that. They do not set themselves up for this kind of embarrassment. You could see that this really was an embarrassment and a big fail for McConnell, and now he is facing a tremendous amount of pressure to step down for being part of such a debacle. This tells you that when McConnell's whip was counting the votes, that he had obviously been told that John McCain was going to support the skinny healthcare repeal bill. Now, I'm not a big fan of the skinny repeal bill. I think they should go for complete repeal, and then they should have had a plan in place, but they didn't, because they were never serious about getting rid of Obamacare in the first place. But now they're in a position where they have to. But at least one thing they could all do is agree that Obamacare is collapsing. It's a disaster and a failure. And this bill, the skinny bill, would have at least have taken a major step in the right direction. And over the next couple of years, they could continue to do things to modify whatever plan they come up with to come up with a better free market replacement for Obamacare. But the first thing you have to do is stop the bleeding. When you have a patient in front of you with a sucking chest wound, the first thing you do, open the airway, stop the breathing. Or stop the bleeding, I'm sorry. Open the airway and stop the bleeding. Everyone knows this. This is where Obamacare is right now. It's on the table. It's bleeding out. It's got a sucking chest wound and it's gagging for air. The skinny healthcare bill was a way to open the airway and stop the bleeding. Now, there was several other Republicans, members of the Freedom Caucus, hardcore principled guys like Rand Paul, who did not want to vote for this bill. Mike Lee, Ted Cruz did not want to vote for this bill, but they understood the consequences and where we are in this particular fiasco, and they understand that this skinny healthcare bill was the best they can get for now, that they have to keep working on it. But not voting for this bill continues Obamacare, which is in a complete state of collapse. And a lot of Republicans are going to be challenged by Democrats. They're going to be challenged in the primaries, and it was a difficult vote. But you saw that even Rand Paul, who's been steadfast in his principles not to buy into any crummy healthcare replacement bill, bit the bullet, went against his principles, which is something he does not like to do, as well as Cruz and Mike Lee, and even the senator from Missouri, I forget his name, but even he did. None of these guys wanted to vote for this bill, but they bit the bullet and they did it. And after doing so, John McCain comes out and drops this. Now, what was John McCain doing? Well, part of it is he knows this is probably his last major vote. He wants to go out with one last hurrah and supplying some more information that would suggest he was this maverick. He's got this reputation as being a maverick. It's not that he's a maverick. It's just that he's an unhinged lunatic who likes to create problems for his own party. He likes to side with Democrats. He likes chaos. He likes to create a lot of problems. He's an a-hole. That's why he got the name McNasty. John McCain, it is now rumored that there were some reporters in the hallway as John McCain walked out of the chamber, and apparently he looked at a colleague as he was walking by and said to his colleague, "Now let's see Trump make America great again," after casting that vote. It's pretty obvious what this was. John McCain knows this is probably his last major vote, and he wanted one last chance to give Donald Trump the middle finger. But in doing so, he also gave his party the middle finger. He gave Mitch McConnell the middle finger. He gave you the middle finger. And he has put us back to probably worse than the starting point to try to deal with the failing disaster that is Obamacare. Now, Senator McConnell is the majority leader, therefore he decides and makes the appointments on the various committees. I would not be the least bit surprised after what John McCain just did to Mitch McConnell, that Mitch McConnell won't yank his ass off of those committees he sits on. The Intel Committee, the Judiciary Committee, and one other committee he sits on. Very powerful committees. Would not be surprised to see McConnell retaliate by pulling McCain off of those committees. I certainly would have. The very moment he gave the thumbs down, I would have sent a memo. Tell McCain he's off of these 3 committees. He's done. Not only that, but John McCain made Rand Paul, Mike Lee, and Ted Cruz and this senator from Kansas very, very angry because they bit the bullet and now they're going to take heat voting for something they didn't want to vote for, but they were trying to do the right thing, and now their vote was worthless. It didn't matter because John McCain killed it. But now they're stuck with voting for it. You bet they're steaming. You bet those guys are steaming mad. Because they had to know. They had to talk to the whip and say, I need to know. Hey, I don't want to be the guy to kill this thing, okay? This is not what we want. I don't like it, but I'll take one for the team. But assure me that we got the votes. They had to be assured. Lee, Paul, and Cruz, and the senator from Kansas had to have been assured that they had the votes. Turns out they didn't because they counted on John McCain. And when you count on John McCain, you lose. John McCain thinks this was a wonderful move for him. He'll be loved by the folks over at MSNBC and CNN, and that's where you'll see his face pop up in the next 24 to 48 hours as they lavish praise upon him. The liberal blogs will love him for a couple hours, but a day or two from now, they'll forget all about it. But the Republicans won't, nor will Mr. McConnell or President Trump. They will not forget this. And John McCain did himself a big disservice, and he did the party a disservice because his seat will have to be filled in a special election. And I can assure you, the establishment already had a candidate lined up to take McCain's place and continue being an establishment whore like John McCain. But now, because of this stupid move by John McCain, dastardly move, there will be people, and there probably already was people, challenging this establishment candidate who will be trying to fill John McCain's Senate seat. And now they will have a perfect winning strategy to defeating the establishment candidate for that seat in Arizona. They can simply say, well, you saw John McCain, who was an establishment candidate. You saw what he did to you. And now they want to put this guy in his place, who is basically John McCain. Same thing, establishment candidate, and he will screw you too. I will support the president. I will vote for any bill that gets rid of Obamacare, even if it's not perfect, because Obamacare is a disaster and it's failing. So I believe that Senator McGoo, thinking he was doing a wonderful thing for his legacy and his reputation as a maverick, may have just slit his own throat. I believe this will come back to boomerang him in a very, very negative way. The Republicans, Mitch McConnell, those 4 senators I mentioned, are paying a very heavy price today. They're very, very upset, and the country still has failing Obamacare. If they do not come up with a plan here in the very near future, things are going to get very, very ugly. And it could force McConnell to work across the aisle, to work with Democrats to get some sort of a Obamacare light. In other words, working with the Democrats for another multi-billion-dollar bailout of the insurance companies. More monopolies by the insurance companies, more monopolies by the pharmaceutical companies, and the corruption and the failed healthcare ACA Act will continue, essentially, thanks to Senator McGoo. Unbelievable. This is that type of man he is. He screwed himself. He screwed his party. He screwed his majority leader, which is essentially his boss. He screwed his associates, his Republican associates and comrades in the Senate. He screwed the American people, the Republican voter, his party, all for the opportunity to stick a finger in President Trump's eye and slow down his agenda, which will move forward anyway. And eventually this will all get sorted out. But that is what I've been telling you about Senator McGoo. And you wonder why I beat up on this guy so bad? You wonder why I did the expose on him? You wonder why I compare him to old Mr. McGoo? You wonder why I've been telling you all this? Well, there's your proof, my friends, of what John McCain is all about. Senator McGoo. There you go. That is the collective finger back at John McGoo, which I'm sure most of you are flipping him off right now, as well as Republicans across the country, his colleagues in the Senate, and those who know Obamacare is a disaster, which is going to make people's lives much, much worse. Thanks to Senator McGoo. So a collective middle finger for Senator McGoo. What an asshole. Next, Nada. You left a link for me, or left a comment for me to check out Josh Bernstein. I'm very familiar with Josh Bernstein, and I am a subscriber. I haven't watched much of his work recently. I generally like him. I think his intentions are good, and he's a pretty good guy. He was unfortunately caught up back in the late fall in this phony, fraudulent letter apparently written by Hillary Clinton's doctor, laying out all these illnesses and things that she had. I believed it was a fraudulent letter the first time I saw it. I didn't really believe it. I didn't know how Bernstein got his hands on it, but he did promote this, and he put a lot of his credibility on the line, and of course it turned out to be a fraudulent document. I haven't watched much Josh Bernstein since then. Doesn't mean I don't like him or don't think anything he says is correct or true or good or what have you. It just means I lost interest in him at that point. But to your point, Nada, I did go back and look at Josh Bernstein's 15-minute video about the 5 things that Trump should do. And of course, he's saying exactly what I've been saying, which is that you need to go on offense. You cannot be on defense. You cannot score on defense. You can only get beat to a pulp on defense. The problem with what Josh is suggesting is exactly what I've been saying in my videos. Yes, you need to go after the Clinton Foundation. Yes, you need to reopen the email investigation. Yes, you need to take a look at all the other crimes that Josh laid out, of which he laid out 5 different special prosecutors that should be appointed, or 5 prosecutors to look at 5 different things. But the only problem with that is something that most of us know, and it is true that that's what needs to happen. The problem with that he's forgetting, is that Jeff Sessions is the Attorney General. He is the man who would have to launch those investigations. Donald Trump really cannot call Sessions in and say, I want you to do this, 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 and this. He could, but if he did, or even had a meeting with Sessions about these things, that in itself would turn into another gigantic scandal. Another gigantic scandal. Did the president interfere and obstruct justice by telling the Attorney General to do all these things? The Attorney General is supposed to act independently of the executive branch. Now we know that's not what happens. We know that most Attorney Generals are partisans. We know that was true of Eric Holder and Loretta Lynch. They both acted in the best interest of Obama. But you got to be very careful how you do that. And of course the media would give them a free pass on it. Trump will not get the free pass. He understands this. Jeff Sessions has, for whatever reason, determined that anything having to do with Russia or the Hillary Clinton investigation, or anything practically that Josh Bernstein mentioned, is something he can no longer take part in because he recused himself. This is why I say that Jeff Sessions should step down and allow another Attorney General to come in who can deal with these issues. The bottom line is, you need to get rid of Mueller. And I would just go ahead and get rid of Mueller and let the chips fall where they may. Yes, I know people in the Senate like Lindsey Graham and others have said, yeah, well, let him get rid of Sessions, and we promise he will not get a new Attorney General confirmed within the next year. I would take that challenge if I were Donald Trump. I'd say, oh yeah? Well, let's see how that works out for you. I would fire Jeff Sessions or ask for his resignation. Then I would make my appointment, and then I would let those Republican senators try to hold up my appointment and see what happens to them. Because as soon as they did it, I would get out there on my Twitter account, if I were Donald Trump, or have a press conference and say, I fired Sessions for the following reasons, and I asked him to resign for the following reasons, and now I have a new Attorney General, and the Republicans in the Senate are purposely holding up that nomination. Now what would happen is within about 24 hours, their phone calls, their offices would be flooded with phone calls from Republican voters across the country, and they would snap to it in a hurry and get back to those proceedings. And the threats made not to move on approving his new Attorney General, that would go away very, very quickly. I would call their bluff on that one if I were President Trump. Now, you also have the option of having the FBI director refer the Attorney General who is the acting Attorney General, essentially, because it's Rosenstein, because Sessions has recused himself from all these things. So all the things that Bernstein suggests that Sessions should do, he has already made the decision he can't do because he recused himself. That leaves it to Rosenstein. Well, Rosenstein is on the other team. So Rosenstein is not going to do any of those things, Josh. Now maybe the FBI director could recommend these things to the acting Attorney General Rosenstein. But that happens to be Mr. McCabe, who himself is under 3 criminal investigations, who is a Hillary supporter and an anti-Trumper. I don't think that's going to happen. So what needs to happen is hopefully Christopher Wray will assume his duties as FBI director here very shortly, and he will look at Mr. McCabe and say he wants a clean slate, and he will get rid of Mr. McCabe, and that will take care of that. Then it just has to be determined whether Christopher Wray will pursue these crimes that Josh Bernstein talked about, because then Christopher Wray, the FBI director, can refer these crimes with the evidence he has put together to Mr. Rosenstein and make it very, very difficult for Mr. Rosenstein not to act on his referrals. He could even go public. Then you could have the FBI director saying, "Hey, I've referred these cases to the Attorney General and recommended special prosecutors. He's refusing to act. That is causing me a problem." Which case Trump would be justified in firing Mr. Rosenstein. At which point, we could see how Jeff Sessions has acted. Now, most of you have noticed, Trump has taken about the last week and a half to launch some pretty nasty criticism at Sessions. And I think Sessions is getting the point, which is, hey, buddy, you got to act. You got to do something. You can't just sit back and do nothing. So one of two things. Either Jeff Sessions is going to get off his ass and finally do something, or he's not, and the arrows will continue being launched in his direction. And eventually, he will simply have to step down, because you can't be under constant attack by your own president and people around him for being lame. You know, you're going to have to do something. So I see this is how this has to work. But nada, I agree that things Josh Bernstein says need to be done. It's just that Sessions simply has recused himself from being able to do any of these things. So that's my thoughts on that. Thank you so much, Nada, for mentioning that in the comments section. And I would encourage everyone to watch that video. Just type in Josh Bernstein, click on This Week, and click on the video that's basically where he says how to stop the Mueller investigation. It's good information, but he doesn't really answer the major issue that we all know, which is you got Sessions sitting there who've recused himself and apparently believes he can do nothing. Okay, now let's get to some more things regarding the Bill Browder testimony, the revelations he made. I commented briefly on this on the last video because I really only had a chance. His entire interview was 1 hour and 43 minutes. His hearing was 1 hour 43 minutes. I watched this Lindsey Graham part, which was about 10 minutes, and I watched his opening introduction monologue, I guess you'd say, the first 10, 15 minutes. But I've had the chance, like Mr. Chopra, to now go back and watch the entire 1 hour 43 minutes. And I've taken notes. And as Mr. Chopra points out in the comments section, there's some extraordinary revelations that were made, which are being ignored by the media, which shouldn't surprise any of us. So it's important that we get these talking points out there and that you spread this far and wide, because as Mr. Chopra states, there were some very interesting things that were learned from the testimony of Mr. Browder, who I think is quite credible. Yes, he does have a personal bias against Putin and the Russians. I understand the personal bias. But on the issue of the facts, which he lays out, which may be disputed or could be disputed, they sound like pretty sound facts to me. If someone wants to come out and refute some of those facts, I'm certainly willing to listen. But until someone can come out, besides Veselnitskaya, and I'm sure we're going to hear from her as well, hopefully in an open session, and I'm sure she will try to counter some of the things he said. But we will see at the end of the day who comes out standing with the most credibility. So let's get to it. Here's some things that we learned from Mr. Browder. Mr. Browder stated that Fusion GPS arranged the meeting between Donald Trump Jr. and the Russian lawyers, because there was actually two, Veselnitskaya and another Russian lawyer who was there he actually operates as a lobbyist. He's been accused of having attachments to the intelligence community in Russia. But there was actually two Russian lawyers there, Veselnitskaya and this Russian lawyer who's a lobbyist who speaks very good English. I understand Veselnitskaya needs a translator. This man does not. He speaks very good English. So this raises into question something I said in a previous video. What about Mr. Goldstone? It's Mr. Goldstone that contacted Donald Trump Jr. by email to set up the meeting. So if Mr. Browder is telling the truth, that Fusion GPS arranged a meeting between Don Jr. and the Russian lawyers, then Mr. Goldstone must have been contacted by Fusion GPS, which means there must be some connection between Fusion GPS and Mr. Goldstone, or Fusion GPS, Christopher Steele, and Mr. Goldstone. The fact that Mr. Goldstone and Mr. Steele are both citizens of the UK, that's probably where that comes into play. but Mr. Goldstone has never talked much about his association with Christopher Steele or Fusion GPS. But I suggested there had to be a connection there. It turns out maybe I'm correct. Mr. Goldstone needs to be questioned. He needs to be asked if he has any association or ever had any contact with Fusion GPS, Glenn Simpson, or Mr. Steele. Mr. Browder stated that Fusion GPS was paying journalists to push the dossier and to publish stories favorable to the Magnitsky Act. GPS was paying journalists to push the dossier and to publish stories, paying journalists to publish stories favorable to overturning the Magnitsky Act or Magnitsky Act or whatever you call it. This is a very important revelation because it shines a light on the media. Were they being paid to run propaganda pieces? Mr. Simpson needs to be asked about this, and he is going to testify, probably in closed session. I'll have more about that tomorrow in Sunday's video. Mr. Browder stated that Fusion GPS created the dossier to destroy, creates dossiers to destroy people. He says that there was a dossier used on him, and he also stated that he put together a dossier for a corrupt group down in Venezuela, where GPS Fusion and Glenn Steele is currently conducting propaganda operations down in Venezuela. They're up to their neck in that. So apparently this is what one thing that Mr. GPS or GPS Fusion, one thing that they like to do is create these dossiers, leak them, and then have journalists go out and comment on them to push them. And money is changing hands while all this is happening. Yes, Fusion GPS and Mr. Steele and the whole group, they definitely need to be called to testify. And I don't mean just in front of a Senate or congressional hearing. I mean in a court of law with a grand jury and a judge. These are criminal violations. Mr. Browder stated that the Trump-Russia collusion narrative is a fairy tale. Mr. Browder stated that he has no doubt that Veselnitskaya was acting on behalf of Putin and the Russian government. Also, that it was a Russian lobbyist who was also present in that meeting, was also working for the Russian government. So he has no doubt that Veselnitskaya was working in the interest of Putin and the Russian government. Mr. Browder says the Russian government was paying Fusion GPS to help to overturn the Magnitsky Act. Also says that Fusion GPS was paid by Russians to create the Steele propaganda dossier on candidate Trump. Just like the same characters he said was paying to create the dossier on him. And also the dossier that's being used against these individuals down in Venezuela. So, from Mr. Browder's testimony, we can ascertain that the dossier was paid for by Russians. It was used by Comey and the Justice Department to get the FISA warrant to spy on Trump and his team. Therefore, Comey was using propaganda commissioned by the Russian government and Putin to attack Trump, which was the framework that was used to launch his FBI investigation into Donald Trump and Russian collusion. Wow. Now, there is something that's a bit confusing when you look at all these things that Mr. Browder said, because he talks about two different things. We have the Magnitsky Act and we have the dossier, for which Mr. Browder states that the Russians are responsible for both. Christopher Steele named the individuals in his source A, B, C, D, E, F, G in his dossier. He doesn't give us their names, but he gives us their stations, what positions they held in the Russian government and Russian intelligence, what relation they have to Putin, people in the government, or whatever their station in life is. To believe that it's the same group of Russians that were paying both to have the Magnitsky Act overturned and to create the dossier creates a very strange sort of situation where, okay, if they're working on the Magnitsky Act and Veselnitskaya hates Trump and this lawyer hates Trump or whatever, but they're working for the Russian government, who at the same time we're told is trying to help Trump, but at the same time they're funding the dossier, which hurts Trump. The two don't work. I mean, unless you believe that the Russian government was just trying to do damage to both political campaigns, to both Clinton and Trump, to create chaos and create questions about the legitimacy of the election and the American system. Now, this would work good in a movie or a spy novel. It sounds like something maybe from the 50s or 60s that would have happened in the old Soviet Union, but it doesn't really make a lot of sense to me in the modern day we're in with the Putin, and particularly the fact that Trump and Putin are trying to have some kind of a relationship, a good relationship, despite the fact that they're both under a lot of pressure not to do so. So I think what we have going on here, to clarify this a little bit, is that I can understand his point where Putin and people in the Russian government, people around Putin, would be working to get rid of the Magnitsky Act, and they would be using Veselnitskaya and Fusion GPS to set up this meeting, the purpose of which was to lobby Donald Trump Jr., or lobby Trump, the president, but lobby his son on behalf of the president to get him to pay attention or look at this Magnitsky Act, to overturn it or whatever. This was a chance just to get, to lobby and pitch the president's son so he could pitch his dad and say, hey, I talked to the Russians, this Russian lawyer, a couple Russian lawyers, they were talking about this Magnitsky Act and all these other things, and maybe you should look into it. Now, maybe that makes sense because obviously the Magnitsky Act is something that would be threatening to Putin and some of his oligarch buddies. That makes perfect sense. But Putin and these same oligarch Russian guys also being behind the dossier does not make sense. So I think what you have here is, of course, there are factions in Russia just like there are factions here. There are anti-Putin factions. Of course, most common is the Atlanticist, which I talk about from time to time. So I think it's very possible that you had two different factions working here. Putin and his oligarch friends' main issue is the Magnitsky Act and getting that overturned or repealed. And so that makes perfect sense, what Mr. Browder is saying here. But on the dossier, that could very well have been coming from other groups within the Russian government, such as the Atlanticist, those Russians who despise Putin and probably Trump, who are favorable to the EU and to the Western system, and probably people who are under attack, political enemies of Putin's, people like that. So I think that we are actually dealing, when we say the Russians did this, the Russians did that, the Russians tried to overturn the Magnitsky Act, they were behind the dossier. I think we have to understand and draw a line here that there are not just one group of Russians, that there were probably Russians who were involved in the dossier, giving Steele information, things like that. And then there were the other Russians. So I think we're talking about different groups. I don't think we're talking about the same thing. I don't think we're talking about Putin and his group being behind the dossier. I think that was a different group of Russian former government officials, maybe current government officials, former intelligence people. We know about the lady that worked in the hotel and all that kind of stuff. So I think that from Browder's testimony, that's the only point that was a little cloudy for a lot of people. It's possible that the same group was responsible for funding the dossier. It just doesn't make any sense. And I can't really figure that one out. So I have to assume at this point, my common sense and logic tells me that it makes sense that Putin and his friends would have been behind the Magnitsky Act, but it doesn't make sense that they would be behind the dossier. It does make perfect sense that Putin's enemies and the Atlanticist and the pro-EU anti-Putin political enemies of Putin and probably political enemies of Trump would have been behind the dossier, or certainly feeding false information to Christopher Steele and GPS on the dossier. So I think that's how I would clarify that at this point, and until some other information or evidence comes up to prove otherwise, that's pretty much my take on that. So that is the important things we need to learn from the Browder testimony. It was obviously none of these things are being covered in the mainstream media. That's why I cover them here on TowerGate. So that's today's TowerGate video, day 146, July 29, 2017. One last thing I will mention before I go. Devin Nunes recently made a comment that's pretty interesting. He has now restated that the House, and he is still the House Intel chairman. He recused himself for the most part, but he still is allowed to speak and probably ask questions. He has recently restated his position that there were Obama administration officials who made hundreds of requests to unmask U.S. citizens that had nothing to do with national security or intelligence. So Devin Nunes has not totally gone away, and he's still commenting on this. So anyway, that is what's going on for today. TowerGate, day 146, July 29, 2017. I will be back tomorrow with another video with some more very important information. It's going to be really heating up here now. We had a kind of a slump period, but now things are really heating up. A lot of things going on. So we will get back to that, and I will be back with you tomorrow, and we'll pick up where we left off. Much more to come. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for subscribing. Thank you for commenting. Appreciate all of you. Take care. Enjoy your evening. Bye.